Hi. Hello, my name is Katie Kiner, and I'm a psychology intern at Texas State Counseling Center. And this is my colleague.
Hi, my name is Uriel Navarrete, and I'm also the pre-doctoral intern at the Counseling Center at Texas State.
Hi, and the purpose of this presentation is to help viewers identify sources and signs of stress, as well as learn self-care, coping, time management, and online distance learning strategies to cultivate academic resiliency, especially in times of change and uncertainty, such as our current situation.
Just to kind of reiterate what Katie mentioned, we'll be going through a number of topics today. We'll be starting off with sources of stress and then moving into the signs of stress. And we'll be talking a little bit about a range of self-care strategies, anywhere from psychological, physical, and social strategies, as well as strategies that are pertinent to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we'll be transitioning into more academic related managing skills for a variety of responsibilities, but also for online and distance learning. And then at the end, we'll save a little time to go over how to access resources on our counseling website.
So we wanted to start with defining stress. And stress is a response in our minds and bodies to pressures and demands that happen in our environment. And so sources of stress can be on two different levels, the individual level and the environmental level. And on the individual level, you have concerns like emotional concerns. So that can be low self-esteem, it can be depression, it can be anxiety, anger, guilt, shame, among others. And these can add extra stress and pressures to daily life. Another source of stress is chronic illness or injury, which understandably causes added stress on people. Another source of individual stress is temperament or our personality, which can involve having different thresholds for stress, and it can also affect how we react to stress too. And finally, past experiences is another individual level source of stress, such as trauma, and that of course can cause stress on our minds and our bodies. On the environmental level, some sources of stress include academic demands. So especially right now, there's that extra layer of having all our classes online due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic in itself is an environmental source of stress right now because it's impacted our environment and our sense of safety. It also has impacted whether people have lost their jobs, and job loss in general is already stressful. Take away the pandemic that we're going through now, especially right now with the financial and the family responsibilities happening. A loss of job can be a big hit and a source of stress for us. Interpersonal conflict with others is another environmental level and source of stress, especially now, possibly being around the same people on a daily basis, which can contribute to increased conflict. Family responsibilities can be another source of stress while also balancing out your own responsibilities. A death of a loved one can be a source of stress. And some sociocultural factors that influence stress on an environmental level include having a minority status, lacking social connections and supports from others, and our political climate.
So with our next slide, I want to draw your attention to how stress shows up on three different levels. And so if we look at the first level, we can look at on the physiological or on the physical or bodily level. There are a range of symptoms that we experience when stress has hit us pretty hard. And so I want to just say that this list is not exhaustive, but it just kind of depicts or paints a picture about what might be going on when we're looking at signs of stress. And so some of the ones that happen on the physical or physiological level is, some folks get really tense in their body, or they have trouble sleeping or they oversleep. They start to experience, acne or loss of hair. And many of us get gastrointestinal issues. We get bloated or gassy, or we start feeling some abdominal pain. Many of us get headaches or migraines, and we somaticize in our body and we get really tired. On the second level is the psychological level. And so when we're feeling a sense of acute or chronic stress, we start to experience a sense of low mood or apathy, or we start to become less interested in things. We get really worried or anxious or irritable and even angry. Oftentimes we feel mentally overwhelmed and our thoughts start going all over the place. And sometimes we even forget to do things. Our memory is not functioning to the best of its ability. We start to lose concentration and we make really poor decisions. Um, and if we move on to the next level, it's the social level. And so this is when we start to experience difficulties across the board in terms of our relationships, whether that be our supervisors or our coworkers or our peers from school and even family members and partners. This can also cause a sense of feeling isolated from others. We're not able to interact in the way that we might hope to do with others. And oftentimes, particularly folks that have a minority status or a minority identity, they start to feel a sense of marginalization from society. So that becomes another layer or added stress. And oftentimes we might experience, as Katie was saying, some socioeconomic difficulty. I mean, I think during times of stress, we might overspend or we might need to budget in ways that we hadn't seen before, we haven't experienced before, particularly when it comes to the COVID crisis. Okay, next slide, Katie.
Okay. So this is a great quote that Uriel found. It's not the potential stressor itself, but how you perceive it and then how you handle it that will determine whether or not it will lead to stress. So self-care is not taking care of, it's taking care of yourself in a way that ensures you are being cared for by you. Self-care does not mean being selfish. Those are two different things. It's really hard for us to be present and help others too if we're not taking care of ourselves. So it's really helpful for you and everyone else if you're able to take care of yourself. When we think about coping with stress, we think about it in terms of reacting versus responding. In terms of reacting, stress reactions happen automatically and unconsciously, while in terms of responding, simply holding whatever's happening in your awareness, you're actually changing the matrix of the entire situation even before you do anything overt, such as take an action or even open your mouth to speak. And so trying to hold what's going on for you in the moment will help you respond rather than react to different situations. And an important aspect of self-care is that it's pretty imperative that it becomes a habit for you to do it. And as with any habit, it takes time to build. So something important to keep in mind is starting slow with small, measurable, attainable, and realistic goals as you help yourself form new habits of self-care. And there's a lot of benefits to self-care, such that it helps prevent burnout. It maximizes your potential. It can improve your quality of life, and it increases your physical and mental resources to manage stress when that does happen for you. So we wanted to present some psychological self-care and coping strategies. And one of them is trying not to catastrophize. Catastrophizing is believing that something is far worse than it actually is. It can generally take two different forms: making a catastrophe out of our current situation and imagining making a catastrophe out of a future situation. So those may be thoughts such as, I'm going to fail this final, or I'm going to fail this class, and I'm going to fail out of school. It kind of takes you're catastrophizing the present moment and putting it into the future too, and catastrophizing outcomes that may happen as you go forward. So instead, it's helpful to focus on what you can do and try to accept things you can't change. Another coping strategy is engaging in self-compassion. This involves giving yourself kindness in the same way you would show up for a friend that you care about. And so that can involve engaging in self-inquiry about what you're needing in the moment and attempting to meet those needs for yourself. And it also involves recognizing that all people are imperfect and that we all lead imperfect lives too. Another strategy is engaging in mindfulness. And this is a really helpful coping strategy that involves being present in the here and now and being aware of how you're doing in that moment. An exercise that I like to give students is called the five senses exercise. We have five senses. We have taste, touch, smell, hearing, vision. And so for those who don't have all five senses, you can do this activity where you start with 5 things you can see, then going into 4 things that you can hear, then being aware and noticing 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. So this exercise is really helpful in grounding you in the here and now to help you focus on the present moment, which can be a really good coping strategy, especially when you're feeling anxious or stressed. Another coping strategy that's helpful is using a gratitude journal. So there's this exercise called the 3 good things, where you can write down 3 things at the end of the day that you can reflect on what went well for you. What were you either proud of or glad that happened throughout the day? And this can really increase hope and optimism in others too. Another self-care strategy is engaging in activities that bring you joy and relaxation each day. And that goes a lot with self-care that we were talking about. This can be different for everyone. Different things bring different people joy on a daily basis and in different contexts. So that may be painting, it may be coloring, it may be journaling, it could be getting out and taking a walk around your neighborhood or your apartment complex, or it could be talking to loved ones or even baking. So it's really finding those activities that help you bring joy and relaxation to yourself each day. And lastly, you can always contact a therapist if that's something you think would help too as a coping strategy.
So on the next slide, I just want to continue on in discussing self-care and coping strategies that mostly have to pertain to one's body. So these are tools that I think are geared toward helping you involve your body in a way that takes care of you while practicing being in the moment in terms of being mindful, as Katie discussed. And the last part is really about cultivating connections with others. And so one thing that I want to say is that each of these bodily resources are interconnected and they build on one another. And so if you look at the first one, it talks a little bit about supportive touch. And so what we know about touch, or supportive touch in this case, is that it activates the care system and the parasympathetic nervous system to help us calm down and feel safe. And so what the science says about supportive physical touch is that it releases a biochemical in the body called oxytocin, which then helps us provide a sense of security, and it helps us deal with really difficult emotions, and it helps calm the cardiovascular system. And I think that this is particularly important when we're inducing or coming into a stress response. So if we look at the second one, posture. And so really what I want to draw your attention to here is really becoming aware of your posture. And so asking yourself questions like, am I noticing that my posture is slumped or droopy or collapsed? Or on the contrary, is it rigid or tense? And really just, becoming aware, where in my body or in my posture am I holding tension? And so if you could just kind of do a brief exercise with yourself and really compare the differences in your feelings, thoughts, and degrees of self-esteem, depending on which posture you're holding. And so, for example, you might notice that when I'm slumped or collapsed, my self-esteem might be a lot lower during that posture. But if I'm upright and aligned without being rigid or tense, that I might notice that my feelings might get elevated at that point, or my self-esteem might increase at that point. And so the next one is really has to do with boundaries. And so one of the ways that I define boundaries is the invisible limits between you and another person. But really what I want to draw your attention to with this one is knowing how your body communicates no. And so this is an important piece, because I find that oftentimes when in my clinical work or even with myself, I notice that if let's say, for example, someone asks me for a favor and I reflexively say yes, when my body is really communicating no. And so one of the ways to kind of tune into that no is, really noticing, does your body tense up? Or do you use facial expressions to communicate no? In other words, do you narrow your eyes, furrow your eyebrows, or do you lift your hands upward and outward? Do you stomp or drag your feet in a protest of no? So really important things to kind of pay attention to. The next one is about breath. And so what oftentimes I'll say that the breath is our lifeline. And so when I'm working with clients, and even when I'm noticing, when I've been really stressed out, I might notice that my breath is really restricted, or I might be breathing rapidly during times of stress. And so we really want to be able to examine how you hold your body. Or so in this case, how your posture is linked to your breath throughout the day. And so what we know about the science, and what I know through some of my work with clients, is that the fuller, deeper breaths, signifying a slowing down. Again, it activates the parasympathetic nervous system. It helps us be in the present moment. And by being in the present moment, we're able to attend to what we're needing in that moment. So we can't do that if we're fixated on the past, or, worried about the future. And so this, the breath is really one way to kind of ease into that and become aware of what's happening now. And on the last part, we can see the piece on reaching out. And so one way to really look at that is when we're looking at our ability to reach out for support. Really, this is based on our predictions of how accessible and responsive others are toward you during times of distress or struggle. And so your body communicates your capacity to reach out. And so if you're feeling mistrusting or reluctant or ambivalent about trusting others or reaching out to others, your body's going to respond in a particular way. And one way that it might do that is, you might put your palms up or your palms down when you're asking for help, or you might extend your arm, or you might bend your elbow close to your body as a source of comfort. um, or you might become rigid or relaxed, or your shoulders might get curved in or pulled back depending on how comfortable you are with reaching out. And so all ways in which I think are important to become aware of. And oftentimes when I'm working with clients, there's an awareness about a client's reluctance to kind of reach out for support with me. And so I might invite them to use a small object that represents a sense of support, which I think is helpful in terms of this concept of reaching out. So I did miss a one important point at the beginning before we went into the resources. Did want to go a little bit over healthy sleep and the psychology of nutrition. And so I'd like to talk to clients about their sleep hygiene. And so this is going to be a very important point to make in terms of self-care strategies. And so one rule of thumb that I always invite clients to kind of consider is you want to refrain from doing work in your areas of rest. And so what I mean by that is, oftentimes when I'm working with clients, I'm noticing, they tend to do work, or they engage in doing homework or assignments, or they eat, or they watch TV in their place of rest. And so what the brain does is it associates those activities with your area of rest, which makes it particularly difficult to rest when it's time to rest. And so I invite you, if you're able to, I know that not everyone has the privilege of being able to do this, but if you can kind of remove all technological devices and reduce the amount of light that you keep in your room, I think that is extremely helpful in terms of maximizing or optimizing your sleep patterns, and being really attentive about how many hours of sleep you need per night. And so on average, folks need anywhere from 7 to 9 hours of sleep each night, some less, some more, but I think the average is within that range. And in terms of nutrition, so I'm not able to provide nutritional advice, but I am able to talk a little bit about the psychology of eating. And so I do want to encourage y'all to, get more information about, either from your doctors or particularly a nutritionist, about some of the foods to eat specifically during this time of COVID. I think when many of us have really susceptible immune systems or compromised immune systems or underlying conditions or hidden illnesses that makes us susceptible to COVID. But in terms of the psychology of eating, I want to invite you to kind of practice intuitive eating. And so really what that has to do is being mindful of how you eat, not just necessarily what you eat, but how you eat. And so if we're in a state of stress or anxiety or worry and we're eating, we're not really being mindful of the activity of eating. And so what I want to invite you to do is to take full breaths right before you eat, and full breaths in between bites, and to really help your system slow down throughout that process and really engage in the pleasure of eating, and really appealing to all your senses when you're engaging in that exercise or in that activity. Okay, Katie, next slide. So the next slide, I want to invite y'all to participate in a self-compassion break, and it's going to be a brief exercise. And so I'm going to ask you to sort of use your imagination very briefly. So if you can think of a situation in your life that is particularly difficult or stressful, and I want you to call the situation in your mind. And if you can actually feel the stress and the emotional discomfort and the difficulty that comes with that situation, and if you can kind of feel all that in your body. And what I want you to invite you to do is to employ the three pillars of self-compassion. And so the first one is noticing that this is a moment of suffering for yourself. So that really appeals to the mindfulness piece right now. And so, if you want to use more of regular language, for lack of a better word, you might say, ouch, or you might say, this is really stressful, or this is really hard, or, I'm hurting right now. And so that, brings awareness to your suffering or your difficulty. And if you move on to the second one, that really points to the common humanity piece, that suffering is a part of our lives. And one thing you might say to yourself is that other people feel this way, or I'm not alone in this situation, or, we all struggle in our lives and we're all hardwired to experience difficulty in life. And so sometimes I might invite a client to put their hand on their heart and engage in that sort of exercise while they're engaging in a self-compassion exercise. And really that appeals to the supportive touch that we mentioned earlier on the other slide. And if we move to the third pillar of self-compassion, that's really about self-kindness. And one way that you might engage in that exercise is, asking yourself, what is it that I need right now in order to express kindness to myself? Is there a particular phrase that speaks to you in that particular situation? So I might give you some examples just to kind of get you going. Is you might say, may I give myself the compassion that I need right now? Or may I learn to accept myself? Or may I be strong? May I forgive myself? Or may I be patient during this time? So really what you're wanting to get at is that kind, supportive, loving language to yourself. Okay, Katie, next slide.
Okay, so we also wanted to provide some self-care and coping strategies you can use during the age of COVID-19, which is adding additional stress to students. So some strategies include limiting news consumption to reliable sources like the CDC or the World Health Organization. You can also balance news intake with other activities like listening to music, reading, or learning a language or instrument that can kind of get your mind on something else and more creative as well. You can create and follow a daily routine of when you wake up and go to sleep, since that sleep aspect is so important, like Udiel was talking about. You can also schedule a routine of when you work in the day, if possible, when to exercise, when to call friends and family, and when to engage in healthy coping activities. I think also staying virtually connected to others can be helpful right now, And there's so many platforms to do this on, like FaceTime, Facebook groups, Zoom, Google Hangouts, House Party, and even texting. So being able to reach out to those for support when you can right now. And at the same time, while I just mentioned like a social media platform, it may be helpful to take a break from social media, because that can be helpful to avoid being so inundated with so much information in these times too. And we also know students have multiple responsibilities on a day-to-day basis, and wanted to provide strategies to help manage them, since they're all probably being done at the same time and at once right now. Before COVID, it may have seemed slightly more manageable, but now everything is so much more uncertain and overwhelming. So some current responsibilities students may include taking classes, having jobs, losing jobs, having to do all their classes online, having family, friends, and loved ones they're still connecting with. And there may also be financial stressors as well, and responsibilities. So we wanted to provide some strategies to help manage the various responsibilities. An important strategy is being self-aware of your needs, because doing that, and with doing that, comes being able to communicate and advocate for your needs and boundary with people like faculty, advisors, employers, family, friends, and other loved ones. Time management strategies can be really helpful right now too. And some things that you can do to better manage your time are, instead of making generalized plans, create daily individualized plans if possible, with more pressing or higher priorities at the top of those lists. It can also be helpful to separate different to-do lists. So say you have a to-do list for school, one for work, one for family and social responsibilities, financial, etc. If you're paying bills, you can just kind of separate them so they're all kind of not jumbled in one, where it's just overwhelming and you feel like there's too much on your plate and it feels hard to tackle any of them at all. You can also break tasks down into you can break larger tasks into smaller, more manageable tasks that help you go slow and get to those main goals that you have. You can set deadlines for these tasks while also being flexible to deadline changes, while I know that's pretty hard to do too. It can also be helpful to schedule separate times to dedicate energy to school, work, family, and social responsibilities. If that's just not possible for you, then you can look for overlap where you can meet multiple responsibilities at once, like group chats where you can speak to multiple people in your life at one time, or studying or thinking out loud while you exercise, or even presenting a class project to family or friends. So those are or roommates. So those are some things you can do to maybe overlap some of the responsibilities you may be feeling overwhelmed with as well. It's also important to work at your mental peak. That may be early in the morning for you, that may be in the afternoon, or it could be in the evening. It's really finding what really works for you and when you work the best and are able to be the most efficient that you can be. The last time management strategy is to take breaks throughout the day to re-energize yourself. So that could be taking a walk in your living space, even if you don't want to go outside. You can do a mindfulness activity or engage in self-compassion and other self-care strategies that we've been mentioning throughout this presentation. You can also reach out to loved ones for support and tips on how they're managing the various responsibilities they have, because maybe someone's thought of something you haven't yet, and maybe you can provide some strategies that you've thought of that others haven't either. And most importantly, I think it's being proud of yourself would be important for making it through each day, because especially right now, making it through each day is a major accomplishment. Yeah.
So on this next slide, I want to cover with y'all strategies for online and distance learning. And so I just want to say that I've had a number of people in terms of my clinical work come to me about how difficult the transition has been for them, to not have a sense of structure or accountability. I think has led to a serious lack of motivation amongst many students. And so I just kind of want to say that just to say that you're not alone in that experience. And so in terms of covering some of the strategies. If we look at the first one, it talks a little bit about being able to delegate a certain time each day or week for a particular subject or course that you're taking. And so one way to kind of look at this is I want to invite you to make a really specific agenda, each day. And you want to be able to schedule it hour by hour. And so I find that this is helpful in kind of allocating a specific time, and in this case, a course or a subject for that hour or couple hours. And then you move on to the next subject or the next hour based on what your schedule says. And so within scheduling your agenda, I think it's important to also keep in mind that you want to be setting realistic and attainable goals. And so you don't want to cram 10 hours of studying or 10 hours worth of studying within a 2-hour block. And so you want to be able to set measurable goals, because that's going to help ultimately with motivation if you keep them small or measurable and realistic whenever possible. And if you move on to the second one, really that's talking about creating a learning space for work-life balance. And so you want to be able to set a work area in your home in a place that is not associated with relaxation or fun or entertainment. And so I know that this um, doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. I mean, I know that it's a privilege to be able to have different spaces in your home where you're able to sort of allocate a workspace where it's not a relaxation space. And so for instance, for me, I put my workstation on my kitchen island, and I realize that that is also a privilege to be able to work in an area where I don't necessarily, spend a whole lot of other relaxation time. And so I would encourage you, if you're able to kind of do that. Um, and if you move on to the third one, it talks a little bit about maintaining or setting boundaries with personnel in academia. So in this case, it might be your peers or your professors. And so I think it's important to remember that you're not required to be accessible to everyone 24/7. So it might be a good idea to really consider setting clear and direct boundaries. And I also recognize in my work with clients that this isn't always very easy to do. So I want to encourage you to really look at being creative about how you want to set boundaries with people. And so I think oftentimes people associate setting boundaries with being really rigid or mean or abrasive. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It might be something like, someone's reaching out to you for support when you're in the midst of your work hour, set on your agenda, and you might say to them, this sounds really important to you right now, and I want to be there, and I'm also working on this project right now. Do you mind if we set some time aside later so that we can kind of address that at a later time? Um, so really getting creative about that. And so as part of this process, you want to be able to leverage all the resources that you have, whether they be Slack. And I know that Slack at Texas State is offering a variety of virtual resources for y'all. And always remembering to be gentle with yourself throughout this process. I think when we talk about academic resilience, we're not talking about perfection. We're not talking about acing all your finals or all your grades. It's being able to hold yourself with compassion and care and support during times of academic struggle. Katie, next slide. And on this second to last slide, I want to invite y'all to visit our Counseling Texas State website. So the staff has generously all contributed to the many, many resources we have available to y'all. So please take some time to really look at that. There are mental health, self-help tools, ways to manage particular mental health concerns and applications, and there are COVID specific resources and hotlines, and there are resources for veterans, and we have our recordings for webinars available. So if you miss something on here, it will be made available to you at a later time. And so again, I would encourage you to pop in to our resource page. And if you're feeling like you need some one-on-one support with the individual counselor, we are offering we're funneling students to sources, one being phone consultations, or we're doing video chat, individual therapy as well. And so feel free to call that phone number listed on this slide if you're needing some additional support. Next slide, Katie.
Okay, so here are our references for the materials that we presented today. Thank you all so much for watching, and we hope this information can be helpful in cultivating your academic resiliency, especially during times of change and uncertainty. Thank you.
Thank you, y'all.